So today we're going to look at measuring readability and talking about kind of what an indices is or an index is and how those are kind of widely used. We're going to be looking at something called the Flesch-Kincaid index or grade I can't talk today. Flesch-Kincaid grade level index. But before we get into that, what is an index? It's a number scale used to make comparisons among values, to see trends in time, or to compare a value to some fixed reference point or reference number. So some examples when you may have seen something like this would be like the Consumer Price Index, the Consumer Confidence Index, the Dow Jones you may have heard of on like the stocks and stuff like that, the Gunning-Fogg Index, which is the GFI, and the Flesch-Kincaid Grade Level Index. And these two at the bottom both kind of measure readability, but we're going to focus primarily on the Flesch-Kincaid Index. And before we get too much into this, so far I've kind of given you a template to use. To open up today, we're going to calculate the Flesch-Kincaid using a spreadsheet. You're going to create a sheet, but I'm not going to walk you through that. So you're going to have a project over this, not over the Flesch-Kincaid, but you're going to have a project where you're going to need to create a spreadsheet, and you need at least a little bit of practice doing that. So where would you start? What would you enter in for headers? How would you format that? Well, we've done plenty of formatting and plenty of formulas, but kind of getting started is definitely what you need a little bit of practice on. So you're still going to use that same Google Sheet, but you're going to create it from scratch. So it's going to be the Flesch-Kincaid grade level is what you're going to call that. But what is the Flesch-Kincaid grade level? It is a widely used readability formula which will assess the approximate reading grade level of a text. So if the text ends up getting a score of 6, we'll talk about how to do that here in a second. This means that a 6th grader should be able to understand that. So you're looking at the score, relating it to the actual grade level. It shows the required education to be able to understand a text. So sometimes how you might use this is if you are trying, well, I think I actually have this in my slides, so before I get ahead of myself. How does it work? It's based on sentences, words, and syllables in a written passage. And this is the formula that it's used. It's kind of weird, but looks like this. So keep in mind, when you're doing your spreadsheet, this does not change, just like the points the points for a touchdown pass is 4 points. It's not 1 week going to be 10 points. It's always 4 points unless it changes overall. But this is 0.39. That does not change. This is 11.8. That does not change. And this is minus 15.9. That does not change. But what does change is the passage you're reading. And those passages you're reading are going to have different words, sentences, syllables, things like that. So kind of a hint here. You're probably going to want to have some columns made that includes words, sentences, and syllables, so you can reference those cells as you create your formula. The two main factors are the sentence length, which is the average number of words in a sentence, as well as word length, which is the average number of syllables in a word for the Flesch-Kincaid. So sentences that contain a lot of words, if you think about that, are more difficult to follow than shorter sentences. And also words that contain a lot of syllables are harder to read than words with fewer sentences. So for an example of that, it was a lackadaisical attempt is more difficult to read than it was a lazy attempt, because that's a big word. So text intended for readership by the general public should typically aim for a grade level of around 8. So something that a 13 and 14-year-old could understand. So like if you're going to give a speech to, to your, in front of your high school peers, you probably want to, you can put that all out into words and see what that level is and make sure that you want them to be able to understand it, I would hope. So you can do that when you're preparing a speech or when you're writing something that you want for on your social media, or you have a website. Like if you're trying to market something on a website that you want people to understand and buy, You definitely want to make sure that they can understand it, that the general public can understand it. So this might be something to consider of value if that's, if that's you. So you're going to create a spreadsheet to calculate the FGLI. Click on the plus button, the bottom left, and then I want you to format that. You may want to consider using a header that includes each line, so you go line by line. So what I mean by that is I think I should break this down here. This is not, well, let me get through that. I think I'll talk about this here in a second. We do an example. But when is Flesch Kincaid most useful? And I kind of mentioned this a little bit. Some ways that you can use this is when you're writing information for a website, advertising your product, right? If this is talking about readability, you want people to understand this. So if you're trying to sell something, you want the buyer to know what you're trying to sell and understand it, and not use like weird words and too many long run-on sentences and whatnot. Producing terms and conditions that don't confuse, boosting your SEO performance for your website, choosing textbooks for a class or training program, editing your novel, for instance, and communicating your research to a non-specialized audience. So like if a doctor was coming to the school and speaking to all the kids, it's like, we probably wouldn't want to be talking in medical language. He needs to talk on our level or on your level. So that type of thing. So some pointers here. We're going to do this kind of problem here in a second. But what I might consider writing down, if you haven't already, is if you're looking at a passage, this is from Harry Potter. If you're looking at a passage, yes, we're going to enter in words, sentences, and syllables, and we're going to be counting all of that stuff up. So it might be useful, rather than looking at the entire passage, to break this down line by line. So we might want to have a column that is literally, we might want to have a column that literally header that says line, and then we just do 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And that way we can do line by line. So here, that's kind of what I did whenever I was figuring out the words. So I'm not going to go through and count all these with you. I've already done that work. But in that first sentence, there's 11 words, and there is 16 syllables. There's 12 words here, 15 syllables, and we get the following. So once I go through and I count all that stuff, now I can add up my total words, my total sentences. The sentences are a little more easy because there's going to be less of those, and syllables. And so once I add those all up and I put those in my spreadsheet into that calculation that we talked about a second ago, you should get a FKGLI of 17.13, which means that a college student should be able to understand that. That's not saying high school kids can't and middle school kids can't. It's just saying that this is written on a higher level. So, and that is the FKGLI.